Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
Our society is rapidly changing. We used to be a civilization dominated by industrial production. Now, we are becoming an information civilization, says Shoshana Zuboff. Zuboff is Professor Emeritus at Harvard Business School. She is a social psychologist and has written and worked on the emergence of the information age, the rise of the individual, and the evolution of capitalism. In the transition to an information civilization, there is one central question. Will we be the masters of information, or will we be its slaves? The answer depends to a large extent on how we, as a society, create access to education and what form this education has. This is what Shoshana Zuboff explores in her talk for the Volkswagen Foundation. The title is The Last School. Zuboff gave this talk on March 14, 2014 at the Herrenhausen conference Rethinking Social Inequality in Hanover, Germany.
Good to see you all here this morning on our last day. This is our core group, right? committed scholars. So, okay, first of all, a confession. I'm not a technical specialist on this topic. Nevertheless, it's a subject that is extremely important to me in my work now. So let me just set a little bit of context for it, the context in which I approach this topic of education and access. I see it as part of a larger landscape that I'm really dedicating this part of my life to trying to understand. And that landscape is what I call the shift from an industrial civilization to an information civilization. And theorizing what that means, understanding it is something that I'm very immersed in right now. The way I look at it, we're standing at a moment where our world is characterized by a classic antinomy. That is, two plausible but mutually contradictory trajectories toward the future. And in one of those trajectories, it's no longer difficult to imagine, and I think the last 2 days of discussion has reinforced this, it's no longer difficult to imagine a future where political capture continues to deepen, where returns to capital continue to outpace growth without opposition, where these forces drive inequality in our societies to unsustainable levels that pit the world's middle classes against one another in a zero-sum contest over an increasingly small piece of the economic pie. This trajectory, I think, can potentially lead us toward those Schmittian extremes that we all dread. A surveillance state defended by force, fortress-like anti-democratic politics. And of course, that kind of future also engenders all the attendant risks and miseries associated with resistance, revolution, even war. These cycles have happened in the past, and they could happen again. However, there's a very different trajectory toward the future, and there are also very substantial forces pointing in that direction. And that is whole new populations of complex individuals all over the world who have the psychological expectation of self-determination. In many ways, humanity has never been more free, has never had more opportunity for self-expression, and has never had more to say. Despite in different institutions all over the world, people have commandeered the networked sphere. We've used it for empowerment, for emancipation in endless varieties of ways, from political mobilization to medical self-diagnosis to just keeping in touch with the people that we love on a daily basis. So how will we write the history of the 21st century? It seems to me that this is the shadow cast by all of the discussions we've been having for the past couple of days. We've talked a little bit about Polanyi. It's interesting to me how many people have referenced Polanyi, the Great Transformation. Polanyi, of course, said that he was interested in the great structural reformation. And intuitively, I feel that a lot of people are turning to Polanyi today because, again, we are in the midst of a similar kind of great structural reformation in our moment in history. Just to go into that concept of the double movement with a tiny bit more detail, because the double movement is essential to what I want to lay out for you today. As you already know, he thought that, well, the pure market on its own is too destructive, and so we need countermeasures, and countermeasures are what he called the double movement. Specifically, he said, quote, "A network of measures and policies integrated into powerful institutions designed to check the action of the market relative to labor, land, and money." Okay. So he's talking about regulation, legislation, democratic oversight, public as well as civil society institutions. That's what he's aiming at. All part of the critical responses that prevent the degradation of these critical dimensions of our lives. Anticipating the future, he urged the strengthening of the double movement. Every increase in integration in society, he said, should thus be accompanied by an increase of freedom, the strengthening of the rights of the individual in society. Okay, my point here is that when it comes to education, according to Piketty, but also to many others, education, as much as it's increased in the 20th century, it actually has not substantially changed the picture of earned income inequality. It also has had less effect on social mobility than many of us have thought or assumed. Nevertheless, I want to explore how education, and especially higher education, might become part of the double movement. And even aside from the strict calculation of income inequality, obviously education is essential for social participation. Education is essential as we move forward, even more than in the past, for the construction of effective life, and is deeply linked to the democratic project. So the bottom line about education is we need more of it. We need it for more people. So going back to Polanyi, this idea of powerful institutions designed to check the power of the market. Part of the way I'm thinking about where we are at this moment in history is that we're in a place that Elias called a blank area on the social map. What he meant by a blank area was a situation that's essentially between institutional regimes, where the old meanings and practices no longer make sense, but the new meanings and the practices that reflect those new meanings haven't yet been constructed. And so it's a blank area. And I think right now that in many aspects of our civilizational capabilities and our institutional landscapes, we are in a blank area where the old institutional logics no longer make sense for us and for our populations. But the new logics are at best emergent and fragile and embryonic. Many of them are under-theorized, many of them are not yet well observed or even named. So we're in a place where we live in what I think of as the lag. We live in the lag. I have, as you know, a very short amount of time, And I've just laid out a fair old chunk of our civilizational life to theorize. So my solution is I'm going to talk really, really quickly. And if there's something that remains shrouded in darkness, then at the end we're going to have a lot of questions, and you shout at me. We're going to skip that because I've already told you about that. So let's go right to the toddlers in Manhattan. And I'm not going to read a paper. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures, and I'm going to talk about them, and hopefully it'll all make sense. Okay, so this is an ad that appeared recently in the New York papers and magazines, and this is an ad for a new preschool. And you can enroll your child in the preschool starting at age 0. So the preschool is for children, infants and toddlers, age 0 to 3. Okay? Now, I can see already the appropriate reaction, which is one of revulsion, right there from that highly intelligent lady. So what is going on here that anybody would send their baby off to this preschool? And the way the thing is advertised is this is going to develop the cognitive resources of your infant or toddler, okay? So, of course, if you live in Manhattan or anywhere in America, or maybe anywhere in the world at this point, these are the kind of headlines that rivet your attention, right? All over the place, what we see is that the top of the pyramid, not only is it a pyramid, but it's turning into a needle. The competition is narrowing. And of course, all these families are looking at this needle at the top of the pyramid, everyone imbued with a sense of entitlement, with the burden of having to construct their own biography. And all of this creates enormous anxiety. And the bottom line is that access is a nightmare, even if you're an elite. So, one of the most popular, has anybody heard of this book? Yeah. Okay, so this is like one of the big bestsellers in America, and I'm sure it drifted all the way around the world. The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, written by a Chinese-American Yale Law School professor. So it's not like she's, just some crazy mother. And her whole thing is bringing the discipline of the Chinese mother to the American scene. You discipline that child, they're working all the time, they're doing their violin, they're doing their calculus, and this is how they're going to get to Harvard. I've got other stories about that, but sadly I don't have time to tell you. Anyway, if you look on her blog, this is what she says on her blog, defending why she wrote her book. It's a tough world out there. Self-esteem has to be earned. Remember that, because we're going to talk about individuals who have the burden and the freedom to construct their own biography. And here it is in the vernacular. She's a Yale Law School professor, but I think she missed reading back. Otherwise, she probably couldn't have written that with a straight face. Anyway, if you go to China, holy smokes, this is the whole deal in China, as I'm sure many of you know. Now, this was a headline that was in the Indian Post recently. So here's a 9-year-old who gets a 99 on an exam rather than a 100. And to punish himself, he sticks 4 needles into his stomach. All right? Now, what do you see in this picture? You see all these little sweetie pies lined up in chairs, doing academic work, looking at the teacher at the front of the room, right? And you can see the discipline, you can see the focus. There's no jungle gym, there's no swings, there's no Play-Doh, there's no paint, right? This is what you're doing. Now, last year I went to China, and I hung out in bars in Beijing and Shanghai, interviewing young people about their college aspirations and their college experience, because they're afraid to be interviewed formally or in public. And even in bars, it was a lot easier in Shanghai than it was in Beijing, because there are, especially in Beijing, there are watchers who don't like these interviews to occur. So I would say about 15 or 20% of the young people that I interviewed were the sort of drones that you would imagine being produced by the system. But most of them sounded just like American kids who were just fed up to here with this deal. But I'm going to just read you this first quote because it's so cool. Children at first are pure. They have their unique thoughts. Society pushes them to delete their thoughts. Now they don't have their real smile. They just do what others say. The parents, the university, the others have taken their thoughts. Okay, so there's dozens of quotes like this, and they're all wonderful, but this gives you a sense of what this system is producing amongst these young people. And then my friend Yang Zhao, who's now at University of Oregon, who writes about the Chinese and American educational systems, the situation is it's one test in China. You start studying for that test at age 0, essentially. And parents compete with one another for how well they support their child to study all the time. And this is like badge of honor for mothers, how they compete with one another, bringing the kid food and having the nice quiet space and so on. So right now, there are 80 million 1 to 3-year-olds in China who are in schools. These are private institutions. And these families are spending 50 billion RMB to develop the cognitive resources of those babies. Funnily enough, the Chinese government is actually trying to stop this. They're actually trying to legislate kindergarten in China and to say that kindergarten should not have academic content, that kindergarten should only be play. Because the Chinese government is worried about the fact that they don't have anybody who's creative. They don't have any entrepreneurs. So they're trying to get Silicon Valley going, which, mixed blessing, but whatever. And, right, so that's the dilemma. So that's coming through Amy Chow, through Tiger Mother, right into Manhattan, okay? You have that picture now? So what's going on here? Durkheim forecasted all of this in his story about the progress of the division of labor. This is the greater violence of the struggle. And of course, according to Durkheim, as the division of labor evolves and becomes more differentiated, the struggle becomes more savage. And it's only through that contest in that savage struggle that we become people who live in a life that is more intense and more varied. We become more complex. We become more differentiated. These new, more intense conditions of existence create new needs in us. And therefore, what is required for us to live an effective life keeps evolving. All right, that was Durkheim's picture, and that's what we're seeing here. So we're going to talk about access to education for a minute. And here are some of the things that are going on in that context. I don't have to go into inequality. I think we've all got that picture. We haven't talked too much about knowledge intensivity. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to show you this picture. The bottom line is, okay, it's knowledge intensive now. In my language, we have shifted from a division of labor to a division of learning, and that shift has essential consequences for the way we think about all of our institutions, and in fact, the way we think about the structuring of our lives. Another very big deal that's going on right now as the context for access is that, basically all over the world, everybody wants to go to college or, the vocational, post-secondary, tertiary. These are increases in enrollment. And you can see here countries like China, Brazil, and India have explicitly, in their federal planning, within the next decade, they have explicit goals to double these numbers. double the numbers from current enrollments. So we're looking at just streams of kids from all over the world who are all competing to go to school, and not all of them are going to be able to go to schools in their own countries because there aren't enough places. There just isn't enough physical plant for them. So what we're looking at now is, according to the latest predictions, like by 2020, 2025, this guy calculates there are going to be 8 million students who want to come study abroad, most probably in Europe and in America. I've seen other numbers that are higher than that, and you can see where we started. In 1975, when I just graduated college, it wasn't even 1 million foreign students, rotating around the world. So we've got some really big changes there. Obviously, another very big deal that's in the context here, and Yen alluded to it, is the whole situation of so-called technological unemployment. It's not technological unemployment, it's capital substitution for labor. And people, they like to call it technological unemployment because it makes it seem like technology has some kind of autonomous life that just ipso facto substitutes for labor. But anyway, maybe some of you saw that article in The Economist. They did a big thing a couple months ago called the onrushing wave or something, and everybody was quoting it. Anyway, there are a couple of big articles that had been published, one out of Oxford, a few out of MIT, and this book, The Second Machine Age, that has everybody terrified about the fact that no matter how smart you are, how complex your work, however high you are in the professional hierarchy, even you are vulnerable to labor substitution. And just before I go on to this, let me just mention a couple other things in the context. One is the network sphere, which we strangely have not really been talking a lot about for the past couple of days. And it is the 21st century, and this is a pretty essential feature of our century. Just for a couple of quick points, 2012, about 34%. Now it's more like, I think about 44% of the world's population has direct internet access. And 90% of the world's population has telecommunications access, a lot of that through smartphones, so a lot of that is also internet. And that, by the way, exceeds electricity penetration, which is only about 78% worldwide, so that's pretty incredible. Now, in Africa, where is the lowest penetration rates of internet around the world, what's really interesting is that the growth rate for internet access in Africa is now approaching 4,000% growth rate. So that's a situation that is changing very, very rapidly. And I thought it was so interesting. The BBC did this big survey, 26 countries, and it was 2010, but still, it's very dramatic. 79% of the people that they polled in 26 countries said that access to the internet is a fundamental human right. Okay, so that's also a very important part of the context that we are living in. And the last thing that I want to mention that adds to the anxiety and the context for all of this discussion about access is the climate crisis. Because there are many people around the world who are experiencing the climate crisis very viscerally, and that's a story about scarcity. And that's a story about, how do I protect myself and my people from the increasing contests that are going to be developed by that scarcity. And so education, of course, becomes a very, very important good in that contest to protect ourselves and our family from these troubles. So when you look through the literature about broadening access to higher education, we could fill this room, and then we'd still need probably more room to just pile up all the studies and all the data and all the statistics. But the bottom line basically comes down to this. A lot of conversations about what's the best way to provide financial support. Should it be all public funding? Well, in some of the countries where it's all public funding, kids don't go to university because they can't afford the room and board, and the public funding doesn't always cover the room and board. So people are looking for what's the right balance of private and public funding. There's a lot of discussion about how you actually support young people and their families in the application process, but a lot of it comes down in one way or another through all these funding issues. That's really the bottom line. So the way I would summarize all of what we've just seen is that the world's students are now more or less a single population. They're all aiming for the same thing, and we've set up a kind of zero-sum contest for all of these kids for higher education, right? And of course, Harvard, where I spend a lot of time, on any single day, you can barely walk through Harvard Yard because there are huge groups of visitors going on the tour, and it's parents and the children, and their faces are tight with a combination of anxiety and wonder. Whenever I'm walking around campus, basically I just want to go up to those people and just hug them and tell them what I told my daughter when she was little, which is, Harvard is no big deal. It's not the only place on earth. It's just another place. Don't worry about it. Just go be happy. She ended up going to Harvard, but whatever. So inevitably these groups are Asian. They're coming from Korea. They're coming from China, and they come in droves. And this is what is driving them there. Their zero-sum content. Okay. So even if we're in a paradise of free to the student, which in America would be a paradise, as I'm sure you realize, that doesn't mean there's no cost, right? So there are a few things we have to figure out. We have to figure out how do we reduce the cost, because there's no way we're going to deal with the zero-sum game if we don't reduce the cost. We have to figure out how we increase the effectiveness, because if we're paying all this money out of our taxes, we want to make sure we're paying for the right thing. And what's the best way to configure it? Right? That also, it all has to be implemented correctly, otherwise we're wasting our money. And as we're thinking about all of those things, can any of this actually be conceived in a way that will contribute to the double movement? So we're talking about access, but we're also talking about access to what? So I want to start with cost. And I'm going to show you the concentrated model. Everybody understand what I mean by the concentrated model? I can't go into it in a lot of detail. But basically, the point here is this is the dominant 20th century model of coordination and accumulation. It was intended, designed, invented to serve the needs of a mass society, mass consumption. It's administered, managed, hierarchies and bureaucracies that maximize throughput with. We have the concentrated model, all right? This is a school in America in 1913. This is the concentrated model. We build the building, everything happens inside the building, and the students come to the building, right? Now, here's a school in 2011. Gee, it looks the same. What's going on here? Oh, and by the way, where did this idea come from? Well, as I'm sure you realize, it came from factories. Here are universities. Universities on 4 continents. We have Ghana, Germany, there's Australia, I can't remember which city, and of course Harvard, all right? Concentrated model, look familiar? Where does this all come from? Well, of course it comes from the factory. That's where it was invented, the concentrated model. That was a factory then, this is a factory now, it hasn't changed very much. Oh, and by the way, let's look at hospitals. Concentrated model then, concentrated model now. All right, so, do you see a problem here? Well, how do the concentrated models operate, and how can we make sense of costs in this model? Concentration is a form of what institutional scholars call deep capture. Okay, so we've been talking about capture. Deep capture is beyond capture. It's really deep. And it's embedded in institutions. You can think of it as a kind of habitus for at the institutional level. So, and this kind of thing is just self-reproducing. There's really no way around it. So this was a very specific form. It was invented at a specific moment in history for a specific problem, and it was very successful right through the 1970s, maybe the 1980s. And to understand the cost, I'm just going to run you through an example very, very quickly, and you're going to see how cost works in the healthcare sector, where the data is very expressive of this problem. Everybody knows that healthcare expenditures are going up, up, up anywhere in the world. This is all OECD data. So we're spending a lot of money, and this is some US data, but you know, these are stylized facts, and I think that certainly my reading of the OECD data is that there's nothing, maybe in a couple of countries, maybe Finland, maybe a couple of countries have a different paradigm, but most of it is the same. And what you see here is that 11% of the expenditure is on home health care. That's for people who are too sick to move. But everything else is for something happening inside the building, okay? And then, of course, what's happening inside the building is we're developing specialists. And specialists cost more. And, of course, then doctors want to be specialists because specialists get paid more. But then if you actually look at what are the things that are killing people, the 9 top things that are killing people are what I call eye diseases. They're what you eat and if you smoke, and what you eat does to your body and what smoking does to your body. Those are that and physical activity and alcohol use account for the 9 top killers. And this is US data, but this is the same across the OECD. So here we have the things that are killing people are the things that can't be fixed or dealt with effectively inside the building. You with me? But all the money is being spent inside the building. All right? That's the concentrated model. That is the insanity that we live in today. And the healthcare data allows us to see it. I'm not going to be able to talk to you about this now, but maybe during question time I can talk to you about this because this is a really cool picture that I'd like to explain to you. All right, let's talk about education. Everybody knows that American college costs are ridiculously high, but worldwide, interesting worldwide study breaking down education costs, very big study. Bottom line is the 99% of worldwide education costs go inside the building, right? It's the people, it's the plant, it's the activities inside the building. That's where we're spending our money. So, are we spending it on the right thing? So, I'm not going to talk about this because that's too complicated, but I am going to talk about this because this is super important. This is a study, and this is a recent American study, and you are going to have to decide if this applies to wherever you live. And I suspect that it does. But this is a study of undergraduates. And what this study shows, this is actually a Gallup poll of all things, but it's fascinating. It shows that support, and I'll define that in a minute, is the most powerful predictor of how a student does after college, after university, in their work and in their life. So, 3 questions. Did you have a professor who made you excited about learning? Did you have a professor who cared about you as a person? And did you have a mentor who encouraged you to pursue your goals and dreams? So if you could answer yes to all 3 of those, you had a 2.3, you were 2.3 times as likely. If you could answer yes to all 3, you were 2.3 times as likely to be successfully engaged in your work after college. If you could answer all 3 of those in the affirmative, you were 1.9 times as likely to be thriving in all areas of well-being. All right, isn't that fascinating? Now, of course, what's really interesting about that, though, is if you look at least at the American data and you see how kids actually responded to those questions, 63% they had someone who made them excited about learning. But only 27% in their whole college time found someone who cared about them as a person. And only 22% had a mentor who encouraged them to follow their dreams. So that's pretty crazy. Ever see this picture? This is the world from 9th Avenue in New York City, right? So obviously what it shows is that, you know, it's narcissism from 9th Avenue. Most of the world is New York, and then there's a little bit left for the rest of the planet, okay? That's the concentrated model. That's the perspective from the concentrated model, right? Everything goes on inside here. And whatever is outside there, you and your complex life and all of your needs, that's something that's not really on our radar screen. These are institutions that were built for the mass society, but now we are new, complex individuals, as Durkheim predicted. We want control, voice, and connection on our own terms. It's a whole different set of needs. And we're in a situation where it's not simply that demand exceeds supply, it's that there's the presence of wholly new forms of demand, that the dominant institutional logic is incapable of supplying. We cannot provide those students with the support they need in the concentrated model with its structures and its priorities and its self-understanding. So we're not just talking about transforming, we're talking about the need for whole new institutionalizings. Now, the way that this has been dealt with in general has been to throw technology at it. That's sort of the latest development, and we call them MOOCs. And of course, the first four letters of a MOOC is mass, and what we see there is that the MOOCs are failing. And there's tremendous amount of rethinking going on right now, because the MOOCs are essentially another concentrated version carried into an automated platform. And they don't provide any of those support aspects that are the real heart and soul of teaching that those students are looking for. So we're seeing the failure rates, the lack of the face-to-face, the high withdrawal rates, and Harvard and MIT, which have launched these huge online courses, are now rethinking everything that they're doing, because this stuff isn't just working. It just isn't working. People are withdrawing. People are not completing the courses that they signed up for. So, to conclude, we are looking at to achieve cost, to achieve effectiveness, and to achieve the right configuration. We're talking about a whole new way of reconfiguring educational assets. By that I mean everything involved in educational assets. The people, the stuff inside the building, the activities, the technology, and eventually the buildings themselves, right? So we're distributing over time across a lifespan. We need to distribute in space all the different places where individuals are. We need to distribute across the social system into communities, leveraging hidden assets, something we can talk about later in questions. We need to distribute across generations. Families are still the largest determinant of what individuals achieve in their education. So families are part of this equation. That means we're reimagining the student now as a person, eureka, in an ecosystem with neuroplasticity. You know that term? Because there's a ton of very rich, exciting literature now. You know, industrial civilization demanded very little of us in our jobs, in our education. It turns out our brains are capable of infinitely more than we've ever had to produce, both in terms of the interpersonal stuff like compassion and in terms of the highly intellectual operations. So that has to be our goal. New needs for the living effective life in the realities of today. This is just my little homage to Piketty. The point here is You know, Piketty saying, yeah, we better figure out how to redo, especially healthcare and especially education, because that's where all the taxes are going, people. And if we want to hold our societies together, we better make sure that we're getting it right and that we're really able to serve the needs of our people. And of course, he's advocating the need for new kinds of institutionalizations in order to preserve our democratic and our meritocratic goals. Last thought. Many people look at the future and they see a robotic future. I see the opposite. I see a different dialectic. I see the future as the human turn. That in these arenas, where our society needs the most work. Don't forget, education and healthcare, 20% of global GDP. This is where we are going to be developing the new institutionalizings. Piketty reminds us that 25 to 33% of our occupations today didn't even exist 30 years ago. In 1833, there was no concept of a working class. There were two classes, aristocracy and everybody else, which included all these other folks, right? These things were gradually institutionalized. They were gradually summoned out of that inchoate social blob to become institutionalized entities. That's the blank area. That's where we are today. New configurations that will address access and inequality so that education can join the double movement, so that learning is not an event but a life, so that success is the last school. Thank you.